Hello, everyone. We're going to be talking today about questions of theodicy. Why do bad things happen to good people? Why do people have things befall them that aren't deserved? So this not comparable in any way to the things we're discussing, but maybe it's somewhat fitting that that just as I turned on my video, my computer decided to crash, and we had to endure a 5-minute delay. So I apologize very much for that. Thank you all for your forbearance. Let's jump right into the topic. As soon as I'm share screen is enabled, we'll share the screen. Before that, we'll just talk a bit about the topic at hand, the question of theodicy, or otherwise known as why do bad things happen to good people, or within Jewish tradition, tzadik v'ralo, rasha v'tovlo. Why do people not get their just desert? Some people some people who don't deserve to be punished get punished. Some people who don't deserve to be rewarded get rewarded. This is, of course, a long-standing question, not just in Judaism but in all religion. To boil it down philosophically, the argument is that there are three factors that cannot really all coexist. One is that God is all-knowing and all-capable. Second is that God is just. And third is that evil or unfair things or bad things exist in the world. Those three seem to not be compatible, because if God knows everything and can control it and is fully just, then why does God allow evil to happen in the world? So that's the challenge of evil generally, the question of theodicy generally. We're going to be focusing not so much on the general question, but on its particular application here today, the last few months with the coronavirus crisis, the world being thrown into this massive health crisis, which in so many ways has been so debilitating and so damaging for the world as a whole. And one of the theological issues that comes up immediately is, why would God do this? How could this happen? What's God's role here, and how do we understand that? How can we believe that God is just and all powerful, and how can that coexist with suffering in the world, and particularly the suffering we've seen over the past months? So we're going to look at several different approaches, really two large-scale approaches with many subdivisions as to how people have responded. There's a lot of material here. We could spend a lot more time on probably any of the sources, but the goal is to give a general survey and maybe point to some trends. So before we get into the current moment, let's take a look at some classical traditional Jewish sources on theodicy, and particularly in relation to disease. So in Shmos, in two different places, there's a promise that if you listen to God's voice, you follow the whole Torah, God promises, I won't give you the diseases that I gave the Egyptians, right? Among the 10 plagues were disease, and you won't receive those if you follow the Torah. Or similarly, you serve God, God will bless your bread and water, and God will remove plague. So the argument goes, if you follow the Torah, you won't get sick. If you don't follow the Torah, then you might get sick, or maybe you will get sick. Similarly, in Parshas Bechukosai, known as the Tochacha, there's sort of a two-sided promise. If you follow God's ways in the Torah, you'll have food, you'll be successful militarily. But if not, skipping, if you don't follow the Torah, if you reject the laws and break the covenant, then God will do the same. God will break the covenant as well. God will appoint all these diseases upon you, and you won't be able to grow things. You'll lose militarily, but included among these is the promise of suffering from a health perspective if one doesn't follow the Torah. So there seems to be, this is what we might call a retributionist theodicy, understanding of why do bad things happen to good people. The answer is they're not really good people. If something evil happens to someone, it must be they erred, they sinned, and that accounts for the punishment that they receive. So that's going to frame one of the general approaches that we have here, and there's much material within Jewish tradition that takes this approach. If you're punished, it's for a reason. It's because you sinned. So that would say essentially, how can there be evil if God is all powerful and just? And the answer is, it's not really evil. The suffering that exists is deserved. It's because people sinned. We see this expressed in the Nusach of Musaf. Why were we exiled from the land of Israel, lost the Beis Hamikdash, etc.? It's because of sin. Because of our sins. There again are many Gemaras where this is assumed. Maybe the clearest place where this issue comes up is the Gemara in Shabbos, where there's a machlokas, there's a debate about the following proposition: whether we say ein misa below chet, the ein yisurin below avon. There's no death without sin, and there's no suffering without a violation. Meaning anyone who dies, meaning everyone, and anyone who suffers, there's a specific direct cause, which is a sin that they committed. So that's Rabbi Ami's view. There's a lengthy Zuckier here, goes into it, tries to prove the proposition. It brings counter examples from stories from Sukkim. At the end, the Gemara seems to conclude there, actually not like this proposition. It seems to conclude there are a few people who never sinned and they died. Yesh misa below chet. It must be one can die without sinning. V'yesh yisurin below avon. And there can also be suffering without sin. That was also proven. This proposition of Rav Ami is disproven. So even though this is a widespread view throughout Tanakh, throughout Chazal, it's also a matter of dispute. And here is one case where it's rejected. But it's sort of the default assumption. The whole sugya is working on that assumption that there can only be death or suffering if there is a sin. It's always going to be deserved. And the conclusion is maybe not. It seems to be reject that idea. Other Gemaras also seem to start with that assumption. There are other ways of dealing with it. One way of explaining how there is evil in the world. How that can be consistent with a just God, or what appears to be evil in the world. And the Rabbi Yaakov says, "Schar mitzvah b'hai al maleka." There's no reward for commandments in this world. So if it seems like someone's suffering in this world, it could be. But in the larger picture, if you take into account the world to come, olam haba, they'll be rewarded much more in the world to come. So actually, it's better to suffer in this world because big picture, you get a more valuable compensation in the world to come. So that's another way of solving the problem, but that maintains a retributionist ideology, right? If someone presumably, if someone's sinning, if someone is suffering, presumably there's some sin, there's some avera that they did, they're getting taken care of now to get more reward later, or something in that direction. A Gemara in Brachos has a slightly different, or it builds on this, but it goes in a slightly different direction as well. Source number 7 here, Imroa Adam, Sheisur Bainal. If a person feels that they are beginning to suffer, so what should they do? Yefashvesh b'masav. They should examine their actions. Pishvesh l'matzav. If you examine your actions and don't find anything you're doing wrong, Yisla b'vitul Torah. You should hang it, say, chalk it up to bittul Torah. You're not learning enough Torah, and that's why you're suffering. And then what if that also doesn't work? You examine your ways and don't find the sin. There's this new category of Yisurin Shel Ava, suffering of love. That's not deserved, actually, but that somehow relates to one's God's love for a person and one's closeness to God. So this seems to, we'll talk about this more later, this Gemara, but the starting assumption sounds like there's a correlation between sin and suffering, although there is this category, it sounds like it's not so common, of Yisurin Shel Ava, where people suffer despite not having sinned. Let's take a look at a couple of other traditional sources. The Mishnah and Gemara and Sanhedrin talk about how one who denies the revival of the dead, Tchias HaMesim, doesn't themselves get revived. And right, kafar b'tchias HaMesim, lefichach lo yeh lo chelek b'tchias HaMesim. You don't believe in Tchias HaMesim, revivification of the dead. You won't be revived yourself. Why? Shekol midos v'shel kadosh baruch hu mida keneged mida. All of God's actions are measure for measure. You do something wrong in a certain way, God will punish you in kind in a similar way. So that's a relevant point as well, that maybe that this retributionist view is that whatever suffering we endure in this world will be similar to the sin that we did. And one final source that will be relevant is a question of universalism versus particularism, meaning the Jewish people versus the rest of the world, how that plays itself out. And Rabbi Lazar says, based on the bracha with Avram, all nations of the earth, all families of the earth will be blessed through you, Avram. What does that mean? Fine, it's sort of an integration of different outside families. And then he says, all nations, even the families of the ground, are only blessed because of Yisrael. And then I think it's cut off. The next line is, all suffering in the world, any tzara in the world, is also only Bishvil Yisrael. So if there's any suffering worldwide, it's because of the Jewish people. Rashi explains Bishvil Yisrael, shenefached v'nachzor b'tshuva. The goal is that God brings suffering upon people in the world at large in order that the Jews will repent. So these are some classical sources, mostly from Tanakh and the Gemara, and there are many more that can be multiplied that point to this idea that there's a correlation between sin and punishment. Both the very fact that every sin assumes or entails, every punishment entails a sin, a prior sin, generally with some minor exceptions, and that there's some correlation, some similarity between the suffering and the sin. And we'll see many, many responses that people have had within the Jewish tradition to coronavirus have been within that ideology, have been saying, well, we're all suffering, there must be a related sin, and let's try to figure out what that sin is and how it correlates. So give one example, Rav Elia Ber Wachsbogel, a senior mashgiach and thinker in the Haredi world. So he gave a speech. This is transcribed and it's in yeshivish, so we'll read it selectively. But the coronavirus, Magefa, and the internet, right? This pandemic and its relationship to the internet. And he points out the pandemic is on a scale we've never seen. That at least from a Jewish perspective, all Jewish institutions, all the yeshivas, all the shuls have been shut down all at once, and that's unprecedented. And that actually correlates to the sins that he believes preceded it. The sins in our generation, because of the internet, Lashon Hara can be spread much more broadly, much more widely, and Gilui Arayos on the internet, as he puts it, can be spread much more widely. So it's midah keneged midah. It's measure for measure. God always punishes in kind, and the same here. The sins people are doing are based on the internet, on spreading things broadly, on globalization, and this disease, due to globalization, will shut down everything so quickly. And then he has an added angle that there are people who are less affected but are carriers. So that's true in terms of on the health side. Young people are not so affected from a health perspective but are carriers. And he says the flip side is true about the internet, that older people are less affected by the dangers of the internet, but they spread it to their children. So that's one example of someone trying to find the midah keneged midah, a correlation between the sin and the punishment. This article by Rivka Lambert Adler collects a whole bunch of these attempts at explaining what the pandemic is about. Keep in mind, this is from mid-March, so the extent of the suffering wasn't yet felt either in Israel or certainly in America to the extent that it was a few weeks later. But there's a survey here of a few different approaches that people have offered to explain why it's midah keneged midah. Right? Mendel Kessin says, well, why is it primarily in China, Iran, and Italy, which was true at the time? The impact was the greatest there, and it's midah keneged midah because China and Iran are supporting bad things, and Italy correlates with Christianity, which has done not great things to the Jews in the past. So that's his theory. Another theory, Rabbi Alon Anava, is that it's supposed to break our dependence on materialism. We're too materialistic, and the pandemic shutting down everything will move us away from materialism. Or Rabbi Lazer Brody says it'll end public desecrations of Shabbos. And again, these are just examples. There are multiple people who point to each of these as well. Or Rabbi Nachman Kahana says it's a wake-up experience for Jews in diaspora. That Jews in Galus are challenged, and now they can't go to Israel even though they usually could. That's a wake-up call that we should realize we should all go to Israel and move there. Or maybe it's a catalyst for Mashiach, or maybe it's a function of the fact that we're not sufficiently focusing on the Beis HaMikdash, on rebuilding the temple. We're not going up on the Har Bayis. We're not rebuilding the Mikdash. Maybe that's the problem. In fact, on this last point, Rav Yisrael Ariel, the head of the Mikdash Institute, he gave a whole article about Kol HaMagefot Ba'avar Ki Zanachnu Et HaMikdash. He goes through all of Tanakh, and he says he has arguments that could be disputed, and actually were in a response article by Rabbi Yitzhak Blau. But he argues that all pandemics, all biblical pandemics, are a function of not focusing enough on the Mikdash, on the temple, and that's why we're suffering as well. So there really is a whole litany of approaches of different people pointing to different sins and saying this is why things have fell out the way they have, and they try to find the Mida Keneged Mida. They say, now we can't go to Israel, so it must be we're not going to Israel enough. Or you look in Tanakh and you find a pattern or whatnot. But these are all arguments to find what the sin is, because obviously the pandemic is a response to a sin. We need to figure out what that sin is and fix it. Rav Tau, part of the Chardal, the right-wing Dati Leumi world, he argues people behave like animals. That's why we get this animal disease, coronavirus, which of course didn't affect humans until just a few months ago. It's because our culture, the culture of postmodernism, with iPhones and improper videos and improper organizations and whatnot, that's like animal, that we're functioning like animals, and that's why coronavirus is able to affect us. And also postmodernism affects nationalism. There's not enough nationalism in Israel, etc. So again, yet another approach. While most of these have been thinkers in the, at least partially in the Haredi world, it's not exclusively so. One example, Rabbi Benjamin Blech in the YU world, he has an article where he talks about God and the coronavirus, and he says, maybe this is like a big timeout, right? It's like putting a kid in timeout when they're not behaving well. So coronavirus is maybe just be a big timeout. And of course, we can give naturalistic explanations. We can say it's based on disease, and of course, we should take all the health precautions. But he says, I think we need to think about this as God punishing us. And what's it based on? So he suggests that it's based on the Aseret HaDibros. Why? The 10 Commandments have 620 letters. The word keser, keter, crown, corona, is the gematria of that is 620. So that's the problem. We're neglecting the 10 Commandments, and of course the crown is also a symbol of God in the world. So that's the failure on a global level to follow the 10 Commandments. So there's, again, this could be multiplied. We could probably spend a dozen hours reading through all the different proclamations as to what the cause is. The point is that a few things. They're wide-ranging. People point to a lot of different things. People try to find some pattern, some connection to coronavirus and the way it's gone about, or the gematria or whatnot. And one more point, which we'll see in a bit, is that very often it's either a person's, whoever's expressing this view, it's either something that they've been saying for a long time, right? Someone says, we're not giving enough attention to the Mikdash for many, many years, and now there's a pandemic. It's because we're not giving enough attention to the Mikdash. Or it's sometimes people, pointing at others, whether they're those who they think are not observant enough or not properly observant, and saying, this is what you're doing wrong. It's very often outwardly expressed, although not always. So hold that thought. One way of looking at this is not only in rabbinic statements, but also pashkvilin. Pashkvilin are these little pamphlets that are put up in Mea Sharim and other Haredi communities, or sometimes even as posters. So these pashkvils, these little pamphlets put up, they point to different issues. So one, the couple we haven't mentioned yet, one is Lashon Hara, which has been getting a lot of attention here. Lo medabrim, lo nidbakim. You don't speak Lashon Hara, you won't get infected, because the logic there is, as some have pointed out, the idea of quarantine, and especially quarantine for 14 days, that correlates with some of the laws of the Mitzorah, of the leper in the Torah, and that's not a coincidence. It must be that there's a connection here, and social distancing. So if you're not acting properly socially, you're speaking Lashon Hara, that's what leads to coronavirus. So we should avoid coronavirus and thereby avoid getting infected. Another cause, this also on many different pashkevil, I think there are 3 here that express this, is tznius, and particularly women's tznius. Women aren't dressing right. They have they have longa shaitlin, they have long shaitels, long hair. That's not appropriate. It should only be short shaitels. Or some people don't like shaitels at all. Or bigad peot, right? Any sort of shaitel, head covering that's not a hat that looks like hair is not appropriate. Or bigadim tzmudim, tight clothes. These are attacked in these pashkevil, and they're said to be the reason for coronavirus. This one over here says, a terrifying discovery. the plague of corona equals lack of tznius. Magifa corona equals shaveh choser tzniut. They both equal 900. So please be strict with modesty, etc. So that's these posters you don't necessarily read about them on the internet usually, but unless someone highlights them. But they of course have a real impact on the culture of those reading it, that pushes people to change their behavior, to I guess be observant in a different way, in what's seen as a more observant way to avoid the plague. Not only, of course, through pashkvils, through other media, through WhatsApp messages. I actually had a chance, someone forwarded this to me, I listened to it. This is from Lakewood. Those pashkvil were in Eretz Yisrael and Israel. This is from Lakewood. Rabbi Mattisyahu Solomon urges the women of Lakewood to take upon themselves upgrading their shaitels, making it a shorter length, and it's an unprecedented plague. So the response needs to be unprecedented, and that will lead to an extra shmira. That will protect you if you shorten your shaitel. So that's a survey of some of the approaches, both in rabbinic speech and writing and pashkvil. One other theme that sort of is a little bit different. Instead of focusing on other people, usually saying, so and so did something wrong, that's why this happened, and this is not, it's not new that people are using that line of argument here with coronavirus. There's a whole litany of arguments as to why the Holocaust happened, which often involve me blaming other people. We'll see. Rav Aviner will cite that later. So there's a long-standing tradition of doing that. I think there's also a long-standing tradition of people finding it distasteful, as we'll see in a bit. But this builds on that tradition. I think there's a theme that's slightly different, that sort of takes a somewhat countervailing angle along the same lines. It's still it'll still be under the assumption that we can identify a sin and try to fix it, but it's not focusing on other people as much as it's focusing inwards. And this goes back to the Gemara we saw about any suffering in the world is b'shvil Yisrael. All suffering in the world is because of Israel. So this was expressed just a few months ago in February, before coronavirus really hit Israel, but while it was still an important threat in the world. So Rav Gershon Edelstein, one of the main gedolim in the Haredi world, he said, "Ein paranus bala olam el b'shvil Yisrael." He quotes the Gemara that we saw before. Suffering enters the world because of Israel. Everything comes from God. Ein ma lefached. God is controlling this. There's no reason to fear. He expressed at that point. What do we have to do? We have to strengthen our faith. But what's relevant, I think, what's interesting here is that he turns it inwardly, right? There's suffering in the world. We should assume it's us. It's us in the frum community that are the cause. And we need to become more observant and more frum in order to save the rest of the world. And this is not, again, he's not the first, Rabbi Edelstein is not the first to do this. There's a long-standing tradition of plagues, worldwide plagues that don't affect Israel at all. And Haredi Gdolim saying it's because of us. We need to improve our actions in order to avert the plague. Rav Edelstein has a related point that he made more recently that I think is really first just another source number 19 as well points to this idea. Everything, sort of giving a nice overview. Everything happens. Everything in the world happens from God. It's all from God. And all suffering is because of the Jews. Klomar, any disease, suffering, or poverty, in order to scare the Jewish people into acting better to avert the plague. So fine, that's that view. Now the related view of Rav Edelstein, very interesting, is the following in sources 20 and 21 here, where this is a couple of months later, after coronavirus hit the world, hit Israel too and America too, and disproportionately hit the Haredi world, as we know, in basically everywhere, in New York, in Paris, in England, in Israel, especially in Israel. Among those who died, there was a disproportionate percentage of Haredim who died, and the attempt was made by Rav Edelstein to justify this. So here's what he said, and there's a recording of this. He said that he gave a hesber l'shir haniftarim hagavoa b'migzar Haredi. Why in the Haredi sector is there such a high ratio of those who die biachas the klal ha'uchlusia? So he said, he said that he said the following. Why? HaChazon Ish Omer שהחילונים שלא חזרו בתשובה הם תינוקות שנשבו ולא אשמים. This is an important view of the Chazon Ish that has broad application, that those who were not raised in an observant household are not fully accountable for not following the Torah, and there are all sorts of ramifications of that. This is a new ramification, to my knowledge, that Rav Edelstein suggested, since if you weren't raised observant, you can't be fully blamed for not following the Torah. Aval Charedi sheyesh lo chet eino shogeg, but Charedim who sin do not have that excuse. V'lachei midas hadin pogaz yoser b'charedim. That's why Charedim are punished more, because we've all failed in following the Torah. Everyone fails to some degree or other. But if you're not Haredi, if you're not really from, then it's not really your fault. You weren't raised properly, so you can't be fully blamed. So you'll only be punished a little bit. The coronavirus only hurt you partially. Whereas Haredim, since the expectations are higher, those who fail are actually can be punished more to a greater degree. So again, this is another way of turning it Bishvil Yisrael, turning the plague, turning inwardly, instead of saying other people are to blame, saying our community is to blame, which is what Rabbi Edelstein does there. And again, I think this is a novel theological point, a novel application of that Chazon Ish about Tinok Shenishba. Obviously, one can object to it for a variety of reasons, but it's an interesting idea, and it's not weaponizing this idea of retributionism. It's using it to try to inspire. And there's a written version that's similar that we're not going to read inside. So that's the extent of our survey of approaches, of retributionist approaches, right? Everyone finds some correlation between what happened and the punishment, and some try to more you blame it on other people, and some turn inwardly and say we need to think about it because it's probably our community's fault. Now, related to this, it's not exactly the same point, but if the retributionist theory assumes that improper practices, not following the Torah properly, is what led to God creating the pandemic, there's sort of on the flip side, the way of remedying the pandemic, one might argue, is to take certain actions. Now, everyone would say that one should follow the Torah and learn Torah and keep the mitzvos. That's not surprising, but sometimes you find surprising theories as to what will remedy the pandemic. And I call it theurgic remedies, or skulos. So theurgy is trying to get God to do something by taking certain actions, sort of forcing God's hand or helping God's hand in a certain direction. Skula is usually means something is sort of has a special aspect to it. So if you do certain things, it'll help you get special treatment and help you be saved. And there's a whole host of skulos that have come up in recent months. I'll just give a few examples. One came up in the Israeli election. Shas very often uses religious themes to help people, push people to voting for them. So here, if you see they had these little ballot card holders that they gave out on election day. Hashmira mimagefa, corona v'chomar in bishin. So this is protection from the plague, corona and any other bad things. Pinchas prayed, stopped the pandemic. So we can also stop the pandemic if we just vote for Shas. Now, the Central Elections Committee wasn't so happy about this. They fined Shas for this because you're apparently not allowed to make religious promises in return for voting. This violated that rule. But this is an example of a skula. You vote for us, you'll be protected from the plague. There's a whole bunch of other skulas we're going to look at quickly. Just to get a selection, a cross section, we're going to focus on several that were endorsed or allegedly endorsed by Rav Chaim Kanievsky, who, again, alongside Rav Gershon Edelstein, is seen as the Gadol Hador, is seen as the great leader in the Haredi world. And very often people will go to him with an attempted skula to try to get him to sign off on the skula. So we'll look at several and sort of trace it over time. So early on in Adar, hold on one second, this was going around widely. I saw people were sending it around in America as well as in Israel. And here's just the typed form. Bidvar Shash Hisdabkus Mimachlas Corona. This is before anyone had it. It's before in Israel or even in America much. So how do you not get sick? We saw this before. Stay away from Lashon Hara. Why? right? If you speak lashon hara, you get isolation. You put in isolation, and this also leads to isolation. So if you avoid lashon hara, you won't get coronavirus. That's number one. Number two, to increase one's humility, to give in on things. That's number two. And he says, if you keep these two things, your whole household won't get sick if you, presumably let's say the father of the household, is careful about these things, from Rav Chaim Kanievsky. So that was a skula that was offered in early Adar. Then we move a few weeks later to late Adar, another skula that was offered, again typed up here. He quotes the Gemara, Ein Parnas Ba'al Olam El B'Shvil Yisrael, and V'hine B'Shana Achrona Haya Harbe Bittul Torah B'Masino Rabbim. We were wasting a lot of Torah study time. We have to learn as much Torah as possible in order to be saved from these things. And he says this is when they were organizing on Erev Rosh Chodesh Nisan, a prayer day. So and the day of fasting and prayer, Lis Ados be'Erev Rosh Chodesh Nisan Chatzi Yom, to fast half a day, Lis Spal Tfilas Yom Kippur Katan, special Erev Rosh Chodesh prayers called Yom Kippur Katan, and the main part of the fast is the prayer, and that should work fine. And right, and he gives some details of how to do the fast. So that's a second set of skulos, learning Torah and fasting and praying. And of course, here he ties it together, right? He says the reason for the plague is insufficient learning. The way to solve it is to do more learning, right? Those don't have to correlate, but they often do. Let's take a look at a couple more expressions from Rav Chaim Kanievsky. Now in late Shvat, a bit later, someone asked him, what should you do to get a refuah shalema? So gvarim shilmedu davar chadash v'zeh chizuk b'Torah. Men should learn a new area of Torah, kachim zraim tyros, a non-standard area of learning. That's for men. And for women, nashim sheispalu mariv. Women should daven mariv, commit to davening mariv for the rest of their lives as a chumrah. He's presuming they don't need to generally, and that should be a skula that should help. And yet another skula, and this you have to be a little skeptical about because it was publicized by an organization that supports writing Sifrei Torah. But apparently, Rav Kanievsky said writing a Sefer Torah is a skula as well in the current moment. And then finally, this has been written about maybe even a bit more. The claim that giving tzedakah to Kupat Ha'ir, which is a tzedakah organization organized by those. If you give tzedakah, if you give at least 3,000 shekel, $800 and so, then you will enjoy immunity from the coronavirus. That was promised broadly, and someone asked, can I give less? They say, no, 3,000 shekel minimum if you want to be protected from coronavirus. This builds on from a few months ago. They were pushing this giving to Kupat Ha'ir as a way of being protected from disease in general before the pandemic. So now with the pandemic, that's even more reason for them to push supporting Kupat Ha'ir. So that's tzedakah, not just tzedakah specifically for the organization associated with Rav Chaim Kanievsky is yet another skula for being protected from coronavirus. Now, there's reason to be skeptical about a lot of this. Just an interview with Rav Shlomo Kanievsky, Rav Chaim Kanievsky's son, where he essentially says, the headline sort of gives it away, Avi mizalzel b'mofsim v'lo mechapes skulos. My father doesn't believe in doing miracles. He is not looking for schools, for shortcuts, for tricks as to how to stay safe from coronavirus or other things. He's always into learning Torah and following the Torah, not into all these shortcuts. So it's sort of interesting that within one person coming out of, in the name of one person, you find such a wide range of, number one, skulos of various sorts, and number two, opposition to skulos. So it's hard to know for sure. There's been some writing recently about to what extent Rav Chaim Kanievsky actually controls what comes out in his name, and his grandson is apparently pulling a lot of the strings. But these are the statements that come out in the Haredi world, and are very, very much influential, are ways of trying to explain and respond to coronavirus. So I see people are asking some questions. We're not gonna really have time to get into them in depth. One question was, how do rabbis deal with the reality when someone dies or is sick, despite following the skula? I don't know. I haven't seen much literature on that. Presumably they would say you didn't do it right, or something else was wrong, or maybe they would say some skulas are not foolproof. We'll see later. One of the sources says that in a time of a pandemic, even if you're not meant to die at time A, you're meant to die at time B, you can still die. So you have to be extra careful. In any event, we're gonna, we're still on approach number 1. So we're gonna see some other approaches in a couple of minutes. One variation of this approach is not to say necessarily why it happened, but there's a way of sort of watering it down or weakening the claim to say, I'm not telling you why this happened, I'm telling you what lessons we can learn from this. So it's not a full theodicy, it's not a full explanation, it's an attempt to respond and to gain from it, which we'll see will overlap a bit with the second approach. Just to give one example, Rabbi Waxman from Muncie said that there's way too much materialism in the Frum community, and that's why that's one thing we should keep in mind is as we're not having fancy weddings and not, so to speak, wasting money on all these different things, we should think about how our community might be able to embrace that sort of lifestyle going forward instead of wasting things. It's really fascinating, and more broadly as just a critique of the entry of all sorts of unnecessary products and religious activities that are sort of meaningless or made up, kiddushim, etc., into the Frum community. A really critique of late capitalism, worth thinking about in another context. But for our purposes, the goal, it's worth noting that this is not stated explicitly as the reason for coronavirus. It's more the way that something to keep in mind as we move past it, or a lesson we can learn. Similarly, Rav Asher Weiss, again, he says, I don't know why. Lo navi ani v'lo ben navi, lo nuchal hadas al ma'as Hashem. We don't know why Hashem did this. He quotes the Rambam, which we're going to see in a minute. But he says, I've always wondered what we say in Shema. Everyone will accept your kingship, God. Well, how is that going to work? We have such a large world. People are all doing different things. How's everyone going to accept God in the world? And he says, well, maybe coronavirus has something to do with that. He quotes the Medrash about the Emperor Titus, that he said, he basically claimed to have defeated God and to be impervious to any response. And God says, Rasha ben Benoshel Esav Rasha, Biria Kala Yeshli Ba'olami V'yitu Shema. I have this tiny thing called a mosquito. The Alei Abasha Vetase Ima Mochama. You're going to fight a war with a mosquito and lose, with this tiny creature. And he says here, maybe it's a similar thing. Maybe there's a little too much hubris in Western society that we think science has defeated everything. And now there's this Biria Kala Yeshli Ba'olami, and it's called a virus. There's this tiny creature, even smaller than a mosquito, called a virus. And now you're going to have to fight the virus and see how well you do. And again, he's not saying that's why it happened, but he's trying to give an insight. He's trying to say maybe at least something that can be gleaned from this is a way of backing off of the hubris of scientism, the idea that science can explain everything, can solve everything. Well, maybe we should take a step back from that. Maybe this is God sending us a message. But again, I think it's a semi-theodicy. He's not fully saying this is why it happened. He's saying this is something maybe we can learn from the fact that things developed in the way they did. All of this is under approach number 1. That's a retributionist theology. Now, meaning that anytime there's someone suffering, someone dies, you can directly point to the sin that led to it, to one degree or another. The other approach we're going to see, I called a responsivist theodicy, meaning it's less trying to understand why things happened and more looking at how we're supposed to respond to it. That's the primary approach. And this, to some degree, comes out of the Gemara we saw earlier, that if one is in crisis, if one is suffering, Yisern Bain Alav, Yifash Vesh B'masa. The first thing to do is look at your actions and try to improve your actions. The second thing to do is Yisla B'vitul Torah. Try to see if you're wasting Torah learning time and improve that. And there's a couple ways of understanding that. One way of understanding that, as we have until now, is that you can always point to the sin that led to your suffering. But the other way of understanding it is what we're going to see now, based on the Rambam and Rabbi Soloveitchik, is not that explains why you're suffering, but that's just the proper response. The proper response to suffering is self-evaluation, self-criticism, self-improvement. And the Rambam here, mitzvahs aseh min haTorah, lizog l'ariya b'chatzotzos, called tzar shetav al tzibur. There's a positive commandment to blow shofar and to cry out to God anytime there's a crisis, etc. And he continues, davar zeh midarchei tshuva. This is an aspect of tshuva. Shebizman shetavo tzara v'yizakula, when a crisis comes about, people cry. Yedu hakol shebiglal ma'aseim harayim hu lehem. Everyone should know, and not exactly clear what he means by know. We'll get to that. Everyone should know it's because of their evil actions. Your sins pushed you the wrong way. And the goal of this is for them to to repent and to remove the tzara, to remove the crisis. Aval, im lo yizaku v'lo yoriu, if they don't call out and cry. El yomer davar zeh miminaga olam irlan. And we say this is just nature taking its course. God has nothing to do with it. If it's sarzu nikro nikres, it's a coincidence. He says, Harizu derech achzarius v'goremes lem lidamik memasim harayim. This is an evil path that causes them to end up staying tied to their evil actions, right? They won't do tshuva, they won't fix their actions, they won't repent if they think everything is just natural. V'sosiv hatzara, tzaros acheros, landed with more problems, and that's a terrible path to go. So if you look closely at the Rambam, you could read the Rambam as a retributionist, right? You sin, God's punishing you, you need to fix the sin in order to stop being punished. However, that's not the way that Rabbi Soloveitchik and his students have read this Rambam. They read it as there's no necessary connection. The reason why you need to do tshuva is because if you don't, you'll continue making the same mistakes. We don't necessarily know that the sins that people are doing, the mistakes people are making, are what caused this. But what we do know is that the proper response to a crisis is self-reflection and self-improvement. So we'll see a couple of places where Rabbi Soloveitchik points this out. First, he writes, this is posthumous writing, about responding to evil. The topical halacha cannot accept the thematic metaphysic, which tends to gloss over the absurdity of evil. We can't say, and this is sort of an oblique reference to Christianity, I think, some religions say, okay, you think it's evil, it's not really evil. What you think is evil is not so bad. No, that's not how halacha works. The topical halacha is an open-eyed, tough observer of things and events. So, and doesn't engage in a speculative metaphysics, doesn't try to say, is it really evil or not? No, we boldly acknowledge both the reality of evil and its absurdity and how problematic it is. And that's, so we have to fight evil where we can. And he says, this is an important line, the topical halacha has evolved an ethic of suffering instead of a metaphysic of suffering. Meaning suffering or crisis doesn't lead us to metaphysics, to philosophizing over why it happened. That's not the Jewish way. According to Rabbi Soloveitchik, the Jewish way is to have an ethic of suffering, ethic of meaning how to act, meaning we are now suffering, we're now in a crisis. Let's not think about why this happened. That's not so important. The way to respond is to think about what we should be doing. We should thinking about what the ethic of suffering is, what we do next, rather than the metaphysic of suffering. And what we should do really usually is two different things. Number one, when relevant, is to fight against evil. If we're talking about evil perpetrated by people, a human evil, then we need to fight against that evil and try to stop it. Or even you could say in the case of a disease, we need to fight the evil, fight the disease, do what we can to keep people safe. That's one response. And the additional response is to focus on religious action, on tshuva, on Torah study, on improving our actions generally as a response. But this is not to explain why the evil happened. We don't do metaphysics. We don't try to say, yes, we did this aver and that aver, and that's why we're suffering. We say we can't answer the question of why this happened. But what we can do is improve our actions, improve our way going forward. In Kol Dodido Fake, famously, the Rav makes this point as well. We'll read just a key paragraph here. The fundamental question is, what obligation does suffering impose upon man? We do not inquire about the hidden ways of the Almighty. We can't know that, maybe. That's building on Rambam's negative theology. But rather about the path wherein man shall walk when suffering strikes. We can't control or understand what God did. We can control what we do. We ask neither about the cause of evil nor about its purpose, but rather about how it might be mended and elevated. How do we take this suffering and elevate it, make it useful, make it lead to something positive? That's how shall a person act in a time of trouble? That's the proper response according to Rabbi Soloveitchik. His student and son-in-law, right, Aaron Lichtenstein, took a similar approach with a couple of small, or a couple of differences along the way. One, he critiques very strongly this idea of searching for shallow and false answers when understanding why something happens. Right, and he says, so what do you do with all the Gemaras? This is sort of the implicit question, right? We saw Gemaras and long-standing Jewish tradition that seems to do that. So Rav Lichtenstein explains, those are questions for Chazal, who spoke in terms of some kind of general correlation rather than with reference to directly retributive causal nexus to deal with, not people like us. So number one, Chazal don't give such specific answers of, this sin particularly correlates to this punishment, number one. And number two, that's for Chazal. We're not on that level to be poking our noses into the why. We have no business making those explanations. He quotes the line about Bilam, who tried to understand God, and the line was, the Gemara says he couldn't even understand his donkey. How does he pretend to understand God? And we have to think of ourselves similarly. We shouldn't pretend to understand God's ways. And again, he paraphrases the Rav here. Judaism has not confronted suffering primarily as a speculative matter to think about why it happened. Rather, it relates to it as an existential and experiential reality. It's something that we're now experiencing, and you have to deal with it pragmatically and normatively. How do I practically deal with this to minimize the evil? How do I deal with this normatively? How do I follow the proper halachas to grow religiously in this situation? And also, Rabbi Lichtenstein casts this as part of one's broader relationship to God. And the key is acceptance. Accepting that this happened to me and not being in denial about it, fighting it if necessary, if relevant. But acceptance is important instead of questioning God. And certainly, he makes the point, and here and in a few other places, that we may say mipnei chata'enu. We may say because of our sins we're being punished. We should make sure never to say mipnei chata'echa, because of your sins we're being punished. Not to throw the suffering, throw the reason for the suffering on other people. That would seem to be very much immoral. So with this background, we see there are some on this basis who have come out against the retributionist theodicy that we've seen, that we saw earlier in so many different forms. One is Rav Amnon Bazak, a student of Rav Lichtenstein. We're not going to read through this at length, but he essentially summarizes and applies Rav Lichtenstein's approach here, that we need to have some humility, and the idea of knowing exactly why things happen is inappropriate. And in the time of crisis, the way to respond is by repenting. Again, I didn't quote the line before from the Rav. The Rav said that Eis Tzara is a mechayev of tshuva. Right? A time of crisis requires us to repent, but it doesn't mean that we know why we are suffering. So that's one example. The Jewish press on this side of the Atlantic quoted a couple of rabbis, right, Gideon Rothstein and Simon Jacobson, who each gave some arguments as to, the question was whether we should look for gematrias relating to coronavirus. So, there's two different issues. One is, are gematrias, searching for gematrias a good idea in general, and does it really work? And if you think you have a reason at all, is that a good idea to publicize or look into it? And they both critique this idea of looking for gimmicks and shortcuts. Presumably, there's also some opposition with the overwhelming, the overly broad explanation as to why suffering is happening. And this piece coming out of a bit more of the Haredi world in the Tzarich Iyun journal, online journal, so sort of the open-minded Israeli Haredi world, that Rabbi Reuven Leichter says, I will not be joining the choir of voices that present a specific cause for the troubled time we experience, right? I'm not going to tell you the specific reason. Lashon Hara, Shabbos violation, breaches in modesty, internet use. I'm not going to give you a reason. I'm going to explain why it's actually inappropriate to find a reason. And he makes the point that there's a correlation here between the physical, and he himself is looking for symbolism. He says there's a correlation between physical and spiritual aspects of the plague. People are very scared of the plague. It doesn't affect young people as much. And it's a way of showing that there's a limit to human advancement. Right? Meaning, as much as we think we've advanced, it only goes so far. And it's a way of Hashem showing us, Kochi va'otzem yadi is incorrect, that it's not human accomplishment that have led to what we did, and there's no foolproof way of avoiding it, not through science and not through giving tzedakah. Sometimes there's nothing we can do. Sometimes we have no way of transcending and avoiding the suffering. So here, Leichter connects these 2 points of both the question of retributionist theodicy, the way of saying all we know, we can figure out exactly which sin caused the suffering, that he disagrees with, and he also disagrees with this idea of skulos, or ways of controlling and stopping the disease. We can't do that, and that's actually the whole point. The whole point of this disease is to realize human limitation and human weakness, and to try to say, oh, I know how we can overcome the disease with some skula or otherwise, is actually missing the entire point here. And he talks about how this calls us to tefillah, again, parallel to this idea of Eis Tzara being a mechayev of tshuva. Here he's saying a crisis triggers the obligation to pray, and to pray in a special way, in a way based on emunah, on putting all of one's trust in God, and not claiming to have any magical solution, but saying, this is out of my hands. Obviously he's not saying, he would obviously endorse people taking the health precautions, but there are some limits. There's no magical way of saving ourselves, and we do what we can individually and collectively. But at the end of the day, this is the point of this, is for us to reflect on our limitations. Again, he's not saying why it happened. He's saying the proper response to coronavirus in that vein. We saw this approach in the modern Orthodox world, in the Haredi world, also Chabad they on their website had a nice article, 6 things you can do about coronavirus. So again, not explaining it, but what can you do about it? How do we respond? And really a mix of a few different things. Follow health guidelines. So that's very much a rationalist consideration. Know someone in quarantine, reach out. Mitzvah of chesed, supporting people in isolation. Check your mezuzah. So there's a little skula of sorts thrown in here too, right? That the argument is if the mezuzah is puzzle, that might lead to one being more at risk. That's the argument. Have faith, not fear. The mitzvah of emunah, giving charity, tzedakah, and be infectious, which little play on words, to be positive, to have a positive attitude in supporting others. So I think this just shows how sometimes you can mix together different approaches. Some skula, some responding to suffering or crisis as an opportunity to grow oneself without necessarily knowing the way of stopping it. Sometimes these can coexist within a single source. Another example, this in the Sephardi Haredi world, that Aryeh Deri, a member of Knesset, the head of Shas, he went on the record as saying 70% of those who have coronavirus in Israel are Haredim. This is as of about a month ago. That 70% of those who got coronavirus were Haredim, and he says, "Tzarich cheshbon nefesh." He says we need you can give all sorts of rationalist explanations. Yesh lanu hesberim, Purim, Batei Knesset, Chatunot, Hakol Nachon. It's true. Purim, we all got together, we got each other sick. In shul, it spreads more at weddings. Those are all explanations of mitzad sheni, tired godel hanes. On the one hand, and still we've been saved relatively compared to what could have happened, but in Israel as opposed to the rest of the world. But he says that number one, we need to think about what do a cheshbon nefesh, evaluate ourselves. Presumably, he means religiously, as to why Haredim did get sick at greater rates. Although at the same time, to appreciate that God protected at least the Haredim in Israel, who were less affected than Haredim in let's say America. So again, this idea of cheshbon nefesh in response to crisis, rather than having a specific reason or knowing or blaming other people, to think about how one might self-reflect and grow themselves. And again, that's also mixed in with some attempt to understand what's happening. Rav Shlomo Aviner, also in the Chardal, the Haredi Dati Leumi world, went in 2 different directions on this issue. On the one hand, he said, what about there are different explanations for corona. Why did coronavirus happen? He said, no one knows why coronavirus happened. And he quotes the Gemara we saw that suffering happens. If suffering happens, should you try to blame someone? That seems to be a mistake, to blame someone. We should never blame other Jews and criticize their actions. He says, God doesn't like it when people criticize his children. That's not the right way to go. He even quotes the sons of Rabbi on coronavirus, which is a great line. Some people blame this disease on various reasons. These are other reasons. We have a tradition from my father. One of our main principles. We don't look for other people's shortcomings. It's not other people's. We don't blame what happened on other people's sins. Definitely now when we're looking for mercy, we shouldn't be looking to blame other people. We shouldn't look for other people's blemishes. We shouldn't establish the committee for finding fault in others. Everyone should look for their own shortcomings. Everyone should do tshuva on their own, and that's the proper approach. So that's one thing that he's got on the record as saying. On the other hand, he also pointed out, and this is not a direct contradiction, it's sort of a different emphasis, but it did stir up a bit of a firestorm. In every evil, there's some good. Where's the good in corona? Almost all of non-Jewish culture is shut down. Academia, the educational authority in Israel, the culture of wasting time, traveling outside of Israel, these are all shut down. All of these terrible things are shut down. And obviously, he got some pushback for that. But if you wanted to be strict about it, he's not saying this is the reason for coronavirus. He's just trying to find something positive, in his view, that comes out of it. And one final case of, I guess, a sort of mix of the two approaches from a very different realm, from Rabbi Pinto, who's a Kabbalist, all sorts of complicated stories in his past, but has a large following in Israel. And he says, what's happening today, what's happening today is like a flood. It's on the same scale as the flood in the Torah. And he says a few different things. What do you do if you want to protect yourself from the plague? Do tshuva. Make sure to say pitum aktoras, because ktores, Aaron in Sefer Midbar used the ktores, the incense, to avoid the plague. So say pitum aktoras, say 100 brachos a day. That should hopefully avoid the plague. And then he throws in at the end also, you should also defend yourself physically, follow the guidelines of the health ministry, because in a time of crisis, you may be punished even if you don't deserve it. You may you may die even without deserving it. So you should be careful in that way. One final approach, and this is sort of maybe the most interesting connection between the two, from Natan Slifkin, who's a famous rationalist, formerly Haredi, believer in science, and he's gotten a lot of pushback from the Haredi world over that in the past. So he says, the Rambam, he's a different spin on the Rambam. He says the Rambam is a rationalist, doesn't think there's any spontaneous reward and punishment. Right? It's not like you do something wrong, God zaps you from heaven. That's not the way to think about it. Rather, mitzvot are the path to intellectual, moral, and social perfection, and avirot detract from that. Right? The mitzvos, belief in God, and all the other commandments are organized to help you optimize your life. To be the best person you can be, you follow the mitzvos. And in this case, that actually explains things very well. It doesn't require any special insight to see what the world is relying on, what they're doing right, what they're doing wrong. Medical science, that's the main factor here. And the people who ignore science are actually, that's what's endangering them. The people who are following science are staying safe. And he quotes the line, "Ezu chacham aruas anola," knowing what's going to happen. Foresight is an important part of wisdom. And those who had the foresight and the proper trust in science to follow the guidelines to protect themselves early are safe. Those who are not, are not. So interestingly, this is, it's basically claiming there's a reason for those who were punished. The reason is they didn't follow these medical guidelines, which God would want us to do based on the Rambam's approach to medicine and rationalism. And those who didn't follow those guidelines are punished, but in a naturalistic way. But of course, that's his argument. The Rambam, all punishment is naturalistic. That's arguable, but that's his view. And so it makes perfect sense. Those who followed the health guidelines, or even were a bit ahead of the curve on that, are saved, and the ones who don't are not. So to summarize, and there's really a lot of material here, but there's two large-scale approaches. One, retributionist. Anytime someone suffers or dies, there was a sin behind it, and we can point to it, we can figure out what it is, we can stop it. And on the other side, once you're suffering, there are schoolos, there are various activities one can take, as a form of theurgy to sort of help God avoid punishing us, or help us avoid the plague. On the other hand, there's the responsivist approach, which says we can't know exactly why things happen. What we do know is that the experience of suffering is supposed to stir a responsive tshuva. That's the way we're supposed to respond, and that much we do know. But we can't point to what happened that made us sick. We can point to what we need to do going forward, not a metaphysic, but an ethic, as Rabbi Soloveitchik put it. And people who follow this have come out and opposed those who give all these explanations. And then some people seem to integrate the two in interesting ways. So I'll take questions in a minute, but just we'll end with the bracha, with the hope and blessing that we that things continue to improve, and we hopefully won't see future disease and future pain and suffering, but and to the extent that we do, we should make sure to respond as properly as possible. Now, let's see if there were questions in the chat. Let's see. How do different models of theodicy map out onto attitudes towards liturgy or adaptations to liturgy for times like these? So that's from John Moses, and thank you for that. I haven't seen too much on that now in terms of new liturgy, new tefillos, new prayers. I haven't seen too much, but maybe it's out there. One thing that's interesting, the Birchas Habayis, the prayer for the house that some people have hanging on their walls, and there's like a, I think, Miami Voice Choir song about it, I think was originally introduced during a pandemic, during, whatever it was, 100, 150 years ago, during a massive, or at least an epidemic, a massive disease. Someone came up with Birchas Habayis, an extra prayer. You put it on your wall to help protect against, maybe read it. So that's one. And obviously people talk about saying Pitta Maktarah, saying 100 brachos, but those are things that exist that they're saying to emphasize. Those aren't really new liturgies. But in terms of attitude towards liturgy, obviously the more one thinks that skulos can work, the attitude towards prayer is that it's the sort of thing that can force God's hand, as opposed to the sort of thing that's meant for self-growth and meditation more. But of course, that's there's a spectrum. There's middle positions there too. Other questions? I think I responded to some other questions about why versus what that we saw from Rabbi Soloveitchik. Any further questions? Anyone here in the chat? If not, we can end again. Apologies for going long, and we should all merit to no longer have to worry about these challenges, these questions of theodicy.